Welcome everybody to the third Tree Rings webinar in the Urban Tree Festival series on the third day of the Urban Tree Festival. I can see that the attendees are piling in thick and fast. So we're up to about 60. I think we'll probably be starting pretty much now. So as I was saying to those who've just arrived, thank you very much for attending. I'm Paul Wood. I'm one of the organisers of the Urban Tree Festival. I hope you've been able to look at the programme for the rest of the week, and there's plenty of there that will be of interest. Do book onto those. This is part of the Tree Rings webinar series that is produced by CPRE London, and I'll be handing over to Neil Sinden, who's the director of CPRE, to introduce them. And the final word from me is just a reminder that we would, of course, appreciate any donations to help fund the festival, and we'll be putting a link in the chat about that. If you could put your questions into the Q&A, Katrina Ramsey from the GLA, who's chairing this, will be able to pick out some of those questions for the panelists. And we'll go through 3 presentations and a Q&A session at the end. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope you enjoy this event. Over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Paul. Just very briefly to say CPRE London is the London branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England. We are working for a greener city across London, and we're delighted to be partners in the Urban Tree Festival and to have put together a webinar series, which I'm hoping that you all had a chance to look at the daily subjects that we'll be covering over the next few days and signed up to those that you're interested in. We're delighted in particular that we have a fantastic panel and chair for you this afternoon, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards on the topic of the future urban forest in London. So over to you, Katrina.
Thanks, Neil and Paul, and thank you all to our speakers and all the audience, 72 now attendees I can see, joining us this afternoon. So as Neil said, today's session is on the future urban forest. So just to introduce myself, I'm Katrina Ramsey. I work at the Greater London Authority in the environment team there. I normally based at City Hall by Tower Bridge, but currently in New Malden. And out there's an olive tree in my garden I'm very lucky to have, and some other ones. And New Malden is also home to some ginkgos, you'd be pleased to know, Paul. On the high streets. So the GLA, we do a variety of things in terms of setting strategy, so the London Environment Strategy, so to increase London's tree canopy cover, and mapping and data around that. We also, I look after some of our grants to help support tree planting and woodland planting and giving out tree packs to communities. And then we also bring together, most importantly, I think, partnerships of all the different organisations involved in London, because I should stress that London's urban forest is a complex forest. There's a whole host of organisations that play their part, including the London boroughs, which we've got Barbara here today from, Jim's here from the Forestry Commission, but then also we bring together other organisations like Woodland Trust, Trees for Cities, the Orchard Project, London Wildlife Trust, lots of other people who help look after and plant trees in London. So in terms of today's topic for discussion, I'm assuming everyone here is here because they're tree people, and we're pro having trees in cities, and we accept that they're good things for cities. So there's lots to talk about today. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that from our speakers. You know, there's the issue of how we look after what we have already and how we do that better. And in terms of new planting, factors to consider from climate change into hotter, drier summers, pests and diseases, and then what to plant and how we might change the look of our streets, which has come into focus already in the current climate, and also our parks, planting, be that planting for shades or kind of just getting more trees into our parks, and then what to plant. I know John's recently been running an Urban Tree World Cup, and the London plane came out on top. But I think there's probably a discussion to be had about those future trees. And when I tweeted about this session, somebody said, don't ask Richard Pearce, I don't think he's here today, but he'll just say tulip tree. So I know people have their favourite contenders. And I know, Paul, your book on London street trees suggested lemon trees might be the next thing we see on London streets because of the changing climate. So I'm expecting lots of questions from you all in the Q&A about those topics and more that our speakers raise. And as I said, we've got some great speakers today. We're going to start with Jim, who's from the Forestry Commission, and then hand over to Barbara Milne, who's chair of the London Tree Officers Association, and then finally John Parker from the Arboricultural Association. So I'll hand over to Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, Katrina. That's really a really nice introduction. If we could have my first slide, please. Thank you. Okay, I'm Jim Smith. I'm Forestry Commission's National Urban Forestry Advisor, and I'm here today to really make the case that London's urban forest should be considered critical infrastructure for London's future. By that I mean it should be dealt with on equal status or with parity with other urban infrastructure like transport, utilities and the built environment. And that's really the reason I say that is that we've been living, we're very fortunate in London, we live with the legacy of the Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian tree plantings. And what we have to consider is how do we take that forward for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Next slide, please. So when our predecessors did their tree planting, London was much less intensively urbanised than it is today. I think it's fair to say that there were less utilities, certainly in the Georgian era. So the large plane trees we see in some of the Georgian squares that were the original plantings, and also through the Victorian era. Much less in the way of services underground, overground as well. And I would argue that it's actually easier in those days to integrate large species landscape trees into the environment. They you know, our predecessors actually just planted trees where they thought it would be good to do so. Whereas in the London of today, we have to really think hard about how we achieve that, the species that we plant, etc., and what we need, what we're seeking to achieve by planting them there. But the biggest issue for trees in London, not just London, but all cities, is accommodating the desired future growth of the tree. So cities are essentially artificial creations, but trees are living, breathing organisms that require the same basic needs as humans to thrive. They need space, water, air, light, and nutrients. And unlike buildings, roads and urban infrastructure, they don't remain static. They grow, they change their state, and their needs and requirements alter over time. So really, it's about how we actually cope with that. So next slide, please. So we're living with the legacy of our forebears, and a fantastic legacy it is too. And if we're going to do legacy planting for future generations, what will we leave? What will this generation leave for the next generation? That's my basic question to everyone who deals with trees in urban environments. How will we deal with the climate change threats, whether they be in terms of lack of water or too much water, or hot summers, very hot summers, etc. And how will we prepare for and deal with the inevitable biosecurity threats? I mean, London's already coping with issues like OPM. We've obviously got ash dieback, which isn't such a significant issue for urban areas, but is certainly for rural, and other diseases on the horizon, such as plain wilt, which, if it did ever get to London, would have a significant impact on its plain population. So I think we're fast approaching a tipping point where species choice is going to be critical for the future, and that's succession planting, what we replace the current urban forest with. And I'm not suggesting we start removing them, but or indeed that we stop planting plane trees, but we do need to diversify the forest that's out there, because I think that all the surveys, the original London Tree Survey, the mid-1990s, and then more latterly the iTree London Project 2014 survey, did show us that we were too reliant on too few species in London in terms of planting, and Katrina's already alluded to that in her introduction. So, but from my point of view, I think what we need to do is to follow the Urban Foresters Rule, the 10-20-30 rule, which essentially says that we should be planting no more than 10% of the same species no more than 20% of the same genus, and no more than 30% of the same family. Not necessarily doing away with avenues of trees, or indeed having a park that has a particular priority in terms of tree species, because that's the character of the area. But across the piece, across the whole of the geographical area of London, we need to be following that urban foresters rule. Next slide, please. Well, many of you will recognise this as the Festival of Britain site, and the reason I've used this slide is that I consider it to be an iconic example of what could actually have been done better, and it's faintly ironic that this was about the UK coming out after the war in the 1950s and looking to the future, looking to what UK's position could be in the future and how it could develop and grow into a vibrant economy and a vibrant nation once again following the war. But if you look on the north bank of the Thames, the embankment there, there are some existing trees there, plane trees, which really stretch from Westminster Bridge, further back than Westminster Bridge actually, past Horse Guards parades on the way to Parliament Square. And that's a majestic avenue of planes. But on the site itself of the Festival of Britain, very few, if any, trees there, and there were no trees planted, certainly along the south bank or in the development itself or its surrounding environments. We had to wait a good few years for any trees to be planted there. Next slide, please. And there it is. That's the same site. That's Jubilee Gardens. As I say, we had to wait about 25 years. So the first slide was from the 50s, early 50s. And this was taken recently. I took that myself from the top of the Eye, the London Eye. But Jubilee Gardens was laid out in the late 70s, I think it was. So the trees planted there aren't that old. But what could have been achieved? What would have happened if we'd planted, at the time of the Festival of Britain, planted out some structural trees within that site and along that south bank? And those trees would have had further time to establish significant canopy cover. And my point being that what we need to do, not just on development sites, but generally speaking, is plant structural trees that transcend development cycles, and those cycles are actually getting smaller. They're dropping down from 60 years that they used to be down to about 30 years, particularly if it's a commercial site. So we need to be planning for the future and trees of longevity and scale. Next slide, please. The reason I put this slide in is this is a slide of obviously a woodland, and I often hear people who talk about urban forests and London's urban forests as well, that they forget that woodlands are very much part of the urban forest, and whether they be remnant woodland, pocket woodland actually in town, or the more usual sort of woodlands that are larger in scale that surround London, in the donut around London, in suburban London. And the reason I say that is they're a significant part. They will be refuges in the future. And I think the COVID crisis has demonstrated to us just how important they are. I've certainly taken my kids to our local woods much more often as a result of lockdown than I have recently, in recent years. And I used to go regularly anyway. But my point being that in terms of trees being one category, one significant element of green infrastructure in London, they are so ubiquitous, the tree is so ubiquitous that it's found on all the different land use types. And what we need to do is London's urban forest should be perceived and strategically managed as a single resource, covering the whole of London and integrated into all its land use categories and their functions. The way to do that is to have each local authority should have a tree and woodland strategy or framework or plan that's co-created and endorsed by all the individual departments, so highways, planning, etc., housing. And what we should be doing is that London trees and woodlands should be differentiated from other green infrastructure and have equal status to that and parity with other built infrastructure such as transport, utilities and the built environment. And the reason I say that is no other type of green infrastructure presents such challenges in terms of retaining it or replacing it. Trees, no other type of infrastructure has health and safety issues. No other type of infrastructure damages highways in the way that we've seen in Sheffield and the responses to that from local authority, that particular local authority. And no other infrastructure damages building foundations in the same way. Next slide, please. So this is Kingsway, you may recognise that, and this photograph was taken at the same time as the picture of the Festival of Britain site. But it shows that we can plant trees. We could have done it at those times. We certainly knew what to do, so I don't think that was a reason for not doing it in that site there. Next slide, please. So this slide, I use this slide. I took this photograph from the top of Bush House when it was still owned by the BBC, and it really illustrates that the difference in time between this slide and the preceding slide when the trees were planted is about 50 years, or the same length of time that we're told that we have between now and the expected impacts of climate change if there's a high to low, a medium to high emission scenario. So the point being that we really do need to start getting our act together now in terms of collaborating amongst all the different professions to achieve that canopy cover and that resilience and that diversity of species that require. And if there's one thought I'd like you to take away with you today, it's that the urban forest should have parity with all those other infrastructure, all that other type of infrastructure, mainly because trees and woodlands, particularly in the local authority context, are seen as the Cinderella service. And we need to change that and get not just local authorities, but all the professions to up their game to accommodate them. Thank you for listening. That's me done.
Thank you, Jim. So I think over to Barbara now.
Okay, Paul, could I have my first slide, please? Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Katrina, and thanks the Urban Tree Festival for the invitation to speak today. I'm Barbara Milne. I'm the current chair of the London Tree Officers Association, the LTOA, although my full-time job is working for Westminster City Council. But today, I'm not here representing Westminster, I'm here on behalf of the LTOA. And just by way of background, in case you haven't heard of the LTOA, we were set up nearly 40 years ago with the aim to promote, support and enhance the urban forest and those who manage it. And we represent around 150 tree officers in London, and there are other local authorities outside London who are also members, and a wide range of associate members too. There's a link on the slide to our website, so you can find out more about us if you like. But the important point here is that the future urban forest is not all about planting new trees, but it's also about the people who manage the trees. And local authorities need properly trained and resourced tree officers to plant and manage trees. And these officers also need to bring their professional skills and their expertise to bear to help shape the policy and legislation to ensure that the right framework is in place for a sustainable and successful urban forest in the future. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So today I want to mention some of the challenges to the urban forest and also some of the opportunities we can take to create and shape it. If I've got time, I'm going to cover the issues you can see around development pressure, climate change, pests and diseases in woodlands, and then concentrate a little on street trees, and finally talk about emerging challenges and opportunities as I see them in relation to COVID-19. A lot of this is about trees in central London because that's where I work, but obviously it can also be applied to cities elsewhere. Ultimately, though, I get to the conclusion that adequate resourcing for the urban forest and professional tree officers who can help shape the urban forest are key to the future success of trees and woodlands in our towns and cities. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So in relation to development, I suppose the intensification of land use in many urban areas isn't a new issue for urban trees. The principal pressure in London at the moment is the need for tens of thousands of new homes to support London's increasing population. And in central London, certainly, that means pressure on existing housing estates to accommodate more units. Now, estates vary widely in character, but many that were created in the 20th century have very carefully laid out communal gardens and landscaping, like the image I've included here of the Lillington estate in Westminster. And it's these green and treed communal areas on estates that are frequently under pressure to accommodate further developments. So there's a very careful balance here, I think. The need for housing is an imperative, clearly, but there's also a challenge and an opportunity to balance this with clever design and layouts to ensure there's adequate space for meaningful greening in the future and to retain existing trees wherever possible too. And the other development issue that's been in the spotlight in central London in recent years is basement development in residential gardens, which can lead to considerable tree loss and crucially loss of available space for future tree planting if no soil's provided on top of the basements once they've been developed. So essentially that's a sterilisation of the garden space where it's impossible to plant trees in the future. Many local authorities have actually recognised this threat and have taken the opportunity through their local plan policies to control basement development, for example, by limiting the extent of gardens that can be excavated and requiring sufficient soil depths and volumes above basements. So even if trees are lost, there's a degree of future proofing for new planting. Could I have the next slide, please? So climate change represents another big challenge for our urban trees in many ways. I think it's already been mentioned, we're already experiencing hotter, drier summers, wetter, milder winters. And that means we're going to need to continue to plan for how existing and new trees will cope with issues like summer drought or temporary waterlogging in the winter, together with higher temperatures altogether. So it's widely accepted we do need to look to expand the range of trees that we plant to include different species that critically can tolerate and also adapt to the changing climate. But you know, in more practical terms, we can take other simple opportunities too to limit the effects of climate change on trees, such as using just simply watering bags around new trees in the streets to make sure water gets to the tree roots rather than running off, or making sure the largest possible area of permeable ground is provided around street trees to allow them to get adequate water and air to their roots. Hotter, drier summers also present a threat of increased tree loss in some areas. That's those areas that have a clay subsoil due to the trees being implicated in subsidence damage by taking water from the soil from below building foundations. To address this, it seems likely to me that we'll need to encourage and support further innovation and research into alternative solutions apart from tree removal if we want to protect some of our largest and most valuable trees. And for the future, we'll also need to make sure new buildings are properly constructed so they can resist damage from trees, as well as continue to manage council-owned trees, as most councils do on clay soils, to limit the risk of subsidence damage by maintaining a regular crown reduction cycle. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the challenge of pests and diseases because of time, but there are increased threats to trees from pests and diseases, which are related both to climate change and also to increased global movement and global trade. There are quite a large number of pests and oak processionary moth is one of them, and Massaria disease of London plane is another, which weren't found in the UK at all 20 years ago, but are now fairly widely established, and they present a real challenge for tree management. So actions and opportunities that are already being taken include monitoring for the presence and spread of diseases. So for example, the London Tree Officers Association carries out an annual survey of plane trees to check for the presence of a disease that isn't actually in the country at the moment, canker stain of plane. We do that on behalf of the Forestry Commission. Individual tree officers in their own boroughs survey their trees all the time, so they're picking up on what's happening with regard to the health of the trees. And there's also citizen science projects like Observatory, which carry out this work. There are other opportunities that we can take to help tree diseases entering and spreading through the UK, such as growing trees from seed in this country rather than importing trees, or failing that, subjecting imported trees to a period of isolation in a tree nursery before planting them out, which might sound familiar at the moment. Just briefly on woodlands, there are challenges in London's woodlands as well, such as declines in some species which are important parts of the woodland ecosystem, and things like visitor pressure and lack of management of some woodlands are also potential problems which can diminish the ecological value of the woodlands. I think the solution here is likely to revolve around long-term management, but the opportunities really do rest on sufficient funding being available to local authorities and other woodland owners to actively manage their woodlands. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I wanted to take a minute just to concentrate on street trees, because I think there's sometimes a misconception that there's abundant space for new trees in our streets. Now, in some parts of London, perhaps more suburban areas of the capital, there is more space to play with, but in central London, the types of issues that we have to consider when we're planning to plant trees in streets are things like pavement width, like this example in Soho that I've illustrated, with pavement and roadway widths which just couldn't support trees. But we also need to factor in things like the presence of all the utilities, the gas, the electric, water pipes below pavements. Lots of central London has cellars and vaults under the pavements. There are highway safety issues to consider, like sight lines for road users, balconies that oversail the footpaths, and all sorts of other infrastructure that pavements have to accommodate, such as bins and streetlights and signage and crossovers. So all of that means that street tree planting in places like central London can be extremely challenging. But having said that, there are design solutions we can and do use to address this. So, for example, I've included an image of a pavement build out in Pimlico, which essentially takes part of the carriageway and creates more space for trees when pavements are narrow. And it also actually allows us to plant bigger trees than we ordinarily would, because the trees are less likely to impinge on the nearby buildings. The other solutions that I've come up with or we've used include creating shared service ducts below pavement, so all the utilities are essentially corralled into one location, and more pavement width is freed up for tree planting, although it has to be said this is an expensive way to do things. But even where there are cellars, we can sometimes even plant trees where there are vaults below the pavement, for example, by making use of greater soil depths in the valleys between the arched roofs of vaults. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is my last slide, and finally I'd just like to mention the potential emerging challenges and opportunities in relation to social distancing, which look likely to be with us for some time. In some cases, I think it's likely that trees on pavements will be seen as an obstruction to social distancing, so there's likely to be some pressure for tree removal. But balanced against that is the absolutely clear recognition over the last 8 weeks or so that the presence of trees and greening in urban areas are a fundamental part of our well-being and our resilience to a crisis like this. And then thinking longer term, if this epidemic leads to a shift in transport with more people walking and cycling and further discouragement of car use in cities, then there are surely going to be more opportunities to alter our streets and change the wider public realm to create more space for tree planting, for example, on wider pavements. And then similarly, if the emphasis in recent weeks on the therapeutic value of trees and green space continues, then in new developments, there'll surely be much more weight added to provide private garden and communal green space in these, including trees in these new developments. And that's just about it from me. Just to sum up, there are lots of challenges to managing existing trees and planting new trees in the urban forest, but there are also some solutions and opportunities that we can take, and creative thinking and adequate finance and sufficient local authority tree officers are all key parts of the equation in meeting these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for an excellent presentation there and a really good summary, I think, of all of the issues at play. So over to our last presenter now, which is John Parker.
Thanks, Katrina. I'm going to try and share my screen. Right, is that working? Yeah. Lots of people on mute trying to say yes to me. That's perfect. Hello, everybody. My name's John Parker. I'm Technical Director at the Arboricultural Association. I appreciate that this is about London's urban forest, and obviously London's urban forest is very important, but it's not the only urban forest out there, and urban forests aren't just found in cities either. I'm currently sat in Stonehouse in Gloucestershire. We might be in the countryside, but we're a town of about 8,500 people. We're an urban area, and our trees make up our urban forest. So most of the pictures in the background sort of faded away in what was thought to be an artistic sort of way, are from Stonehouse rather than from London. So I wanted to talk about two things really to do with the future urban forest. One being sustainable tree establishment, and the other being future urban foresters. So tree establishment, tree planting targets have been a familiar feature in recent years. There's been a huge focus on numbers and how many trees can we get in the ground. These have often become sort of ever escalating targets that politicians particularly like to bandy around. When I started working in London about 12 years ago, a mayoral candidate was putting forward promises for about 20,000 a year, I think. Then we've gone through 50,000, 100,000, 1 million, 2 million. I think the last numbers I heard was that we need about a trillion trees, and we're going to run out of numbers soon. But it's great that we've got all this emphasis on trees, but we're not really thinking about the aftercare involved in looking after those trees. Who's looking after them, and how do we make sure that they actually become established in the landscape? So instead of talking about tree planting for a future urban forest, we should maybe be thinking about establishment. And this slide here is just to show we've got planting in the middle there. Planting's definitely important. We like planting. But then right at the beginning there, we've got nursery production. Somebody's got to make these trees and grow these trees on and produce them. Then you've got to think about the tree specification. What are you going to plant? What species are you going to get? What kind of root ball or containerized? Thinking about your biosecurity in that bit as well. Then your site specification. Where are you going to plant it? In a pavement, on a grass verge? You're going to build a huge complex engineered tree pit, or you're just going to stick it in a hole in the ground. Then you've got your planting. Then the young tree maintenance after the planting. So the formative pruning, the watering, the mulching, who's taking care of that tree to make sure it gets to maturity. The medium and long-term maintenance. Going forward into the future, you might be looking after that tree for decades or even centuries of monitoring and managing. And alongside that is the inspection as well. So these trees have to be sort of looked at and assessed for their safety and their condition. So just looking at that list there, if the nursery production maybe is about 5 years, tree specification and site specification, that might be a couple of weeks. Your planting, well, that's about 20 minutes. Then you've got 3 years worth of young tree maintenance. You've maybe got 50, 100, 200 years of long-term maintenance and inspection. But all we ever hear about is that 20 minutes in the middle, which is planting. So it's great. Planting is important. Obviously, putting the tree in the ground is a critical part of that process, but it's not the only bit. And we need to make sure that people are thinking about establishing these trees rather than just planting them. And just in the background there, you can see a little watering campaign that the Arboricultural Association have just launched in association with, actually this is going to be too many uses of the word association, but with the London Tree Officers Association, the Association of Tree Officers, and the Municipal Tree Officer Association. So that's a little joint campaign we've launched to encourage people to water their trees and make sure they can survive. So establishment rather than just planting, but then someone's got to do all that stuff, all those jobs I just listed, somebody actually has to do them. And I think if you want a future urban forest, you really need to have future urban foresters as well. And there's loads and loads of roles in arboriculture that many people aren't aware of. Many people don't understand quite the diversity and depth of roles we've got in our industry. Barbara's already talked about tree officers. I've spent a huge amount of my career promoting the importance of tree officers, and I still do that now. They're brilliant. Everyone should support and promote your local authority tree officer. They're great, and they need more support. You've got the contractors, obviously, going out there actually doing the work. That's another important component. They're urban foresters too, as are the consultants who are going out doing the reports, doing the expert witness stuff, all the roles that a consultant takes on. And then some of the jobs that are sometimes forgotten a little bit about, I think when we're talking about the urban forest, the nursery industry, the people producing the trees, the suppliers who are producing all the kit, manufacturing the different equipment that we need and we use in our work. They're also crucial to this. Also the academics and the researchers, these are the people who do all of that research and all of that work that allows us to say things like urban trees can help improve educational development in children. We need the research to be done so we can say that kind of thing, and they're doing a lot of work behind the scenes on that. The training providers are hugely important. They're the people, you know, teaching and educating the urban foresters of the future, so we need to be thinking of them as well when we talk about urban foresters. And then the policymakers, blessed are the policymakers, nobody ever talks about them. You know, these are people writing the strategies, writing the policies, people like Katrina there. This is a shout out for Katrina and many people like Katrina. And we need to think about them in the context of urban foresters too, because all these roles and more that I'm sure I've forgotten are all needed. So how do we promote this? How do we support these people? How do we make sure that these roles aren't forgotten? Well, I think this comes down to professionalism in arboriculture. Just for a small plug, this is what we'll be talking about on Arborist Question Time at the Arb Association later on. Too slow, you couldn't stop me putting a little plug in there. 6 p.m, it'd be great. So how do we go about promoting professionalism? Well, raising standards is one way, making sure that we recognise and promote arboriculture and urban forestry as professions, as actual viable careers for people. Raising awareness with the general public, telling people about arboriculture. Like I say, lots of people care about trees, not so many people seem to care about the people who care about trees. So we need to try and make sure we put that right. A large part of the way we do that is through community engagement. That's why stuff like this Urban Tree Festival is so valuable and so good. It's going out there, it's linking up the professional arboriculturalists with members of the public who care and are passionate about it. These are their trees. Trees are a public utility. People working in arboriculture are just looking after them, for them for a while. We often talk about tree officers as being the custodians of the urban trees. We've got to engage the community in the management of their trees as well. Engaging the youth is very important. The picture faded away in the background here is not in Stonehouse. The eagle-eyed may have noticed. This is in Vilnius in Lithuania, actually. But it could be anywhere because the large crowd of people here are protesting about the climate. There's people of all ages there, but many, many young people. And all of these people were going out and actually protesting and chanting for trees. There's a huge movement at the moment, the climate movement, where trees are being recognised as an important part of the solution for global climate crisis. We need to tap into that. We need to engage these people, and we need to promote the importance of trees and of arboriculture. Also, cross-disciplinary interaction. We can't just sit and talk to ourselves. We need to go out there, speak to our partners in the sector, horticulture and landscaping, but also people like highway engineers, some of the politicians and the budget holders. We need to broaden out our scope of who we talk to promote arboriculture and trees. And in doing this, we can hopefully win over the general public. And if you can win over the general public, then sure as anything, the political support will follow too. I don't want to disappoint you or sound cynical, but typically politicians will care about the stuff that they think are going to get them votes. And it was only because everyone started shouting about the climate and trees that you saw so many tree planting pledges from the major political parties in the last election. So public support and political support, both very important as well. So conclusions. What have we learned from this little wander through my mind? Nothing, they cry. Oh, sorry, I'm drowning in a glass of squash here. I'm a professional. We'll get through it. First of all, thinking tree time. This is something that Ted Green said to me at the beginning of this health crisis, actually. But thinking tree time, we work with organisms that last for decades or centuries or maybe even millennia, but we're constantly forced into boxes where we have to think about the political cycle, a 4 or 5 year political cycle. It's all right, nobody panic, I'm okay, don't send support. Or we have to work to the very short term sometimes, public ambitions of demanding something now. We've got to think in tree time, we've got to promote the fact that trees are going to live a lot longer than us if we look after them properly. And part of that is sustainable tree establishment. It's not just planting, it's establishing. We've got to make sure that we get the right tree, of course, as Barbara and Jim have both talked about, but it doesn't matter what species you pick. If you stick it in the ground, walk away and don't do anything, it's going to die, as I think I might die, unless I can make it through the next minute. We've got to support existing professionals, all that list of professions and the different areas of arboriculture. We've got to support those people. We've got to promote those people. And of course, as I've said, tree officers particularly important in that, but also everybody else who works in arboriculture. But as well as the existing professionals, we've got to think about the future professionals. Where's the next generation of arboriculturalists and urban foresters coming from? How do we best engage with people to either bring them through when they're at school or at college, or people later in life who fancy a career change, to see arboriculture as a viable career to go into? And as always, I think every presentation I've ever given, I've talked about collaboration. We've got to work together on this. This is local government, national government, professional arboriculturalists, the community, general public, all areas within arboriculture and all of the industries that we work with. We've got to work together. And it's only through collaboration, through establishing trees rather than just planting them, and through protecting urban foresters for the future urban foresters for a future urban forest, are we going to achieve what we're trying to achieve. So that is me done, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for an excellent presentation there, and really stressing the how many people are involved and the value of collaboration. So that takes us on to the Q&A session. And we've had several people writing questions, which many thanks. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions for me to pose to the panel. So I think we'll start with one from Emily, who asks, which international cities would you say are really successful in urban forestry, and what do they do well or differently?
Well, can I kick off and say I think London doesn't do too badly. I mean, there may be people listening that disagree, but London does pretty well. We plant a lot of trees in challenging circumstances and look after the majority of them. And we also have a really, well, not just in London, nationally, pretty strong legislation, I think, comparatively, to protect existing trees through the Town and Country Planning Act, and to ensure that replacements are planted when protected trees have to be removed. So I don't think London does badly, if I'm honest, but other panelists might have different views.
If I could just come in, I agree with Barbara completely. I was going to say the same thing. I think it's important. A lot of the time, many people who actually work in our industry don't realise this, let alone people outside the industry. But internationally, UK arboriculture is held in pretty high regard. We're seen as one of those sort of upper echelons of arboriculture in the world. And it's very easy to look at the country you're from or the place you're from and find fault with it or criticise it. But I can tell you that I've been very lucky to go all over the place, speaking at conferences and attending seminars and things in different countries. And UK arboriculture is looked to as one of the exemplars internationally. So yeah, I agree with Barbara. London and many other UK cities are doing very well.
I'd just like to add to that one of the cities that I'm aware of that does really well also is Lyon in France, because they've managed to integrate their highways, the work to their highways department with tree provision. So I think it's about linking up those professions, as all the fellow panelists, John and Barbara, have said, is that it's linking all the professions together to achieve the outcomes you want for trees and for the urban forest.
Thank you all. And I just add that I think Melbourne in Australia is often held up as a good example as well, but I think they came from a place of having some really severe drought conditions to deal with, which is what made them kind of take a a strategic step back and look at their urban forests and the age and the species mix there and what they want to plant. Yes, Jen, as you say, Leon's held up as a great example as well. So we've also got quite a few technical questions. Thank you, Mark. Oh, and loads more questions are pinging in on the Q&A now. I'm going to go through the ones that I picked up whilst people were speaking. Mark's asked about the use of cavat. I don't know if Barbara or John want to talk about tell people what cavat is. And there's a linked question about how tree planting is funded in London. To which the answer is there's lots of different ways, but lots of that is from borough budgets, but also some from central government at the moment, some from the mayor, some by local residents. There's some really good examples in Lewisham about local residents funding street tree planting with Street Trees for Living. But John and Barbara, or both, do you want to chip in about what cavat is and also about how tree planting is funded in London?
John, you pick up cavat and I'll talk about funding.
Yes, boss. So cavat is a capital asset valuation of amenity trees. So it's a method that was developed by a chap called Chris Neelan and the London Tree Officers Association a few years ago now. And a very, very simple way of describing it is it puts a monetary value on trees, is probably the most simple way to describe it. So you can put if you have a developer who's got to cut down a tree, and if all else fails and you're unable to stop the developer from doing that, one way of finding some kind of mitigation or compensation might be to assess the cavat value of the tree and then have the developer pay you that valuation. Now, there's lots of problems associated with that. I'm sure the switchboards will be lighting up. But if it's unavoidable to lose a tree, cavat is one way of forming a sort of baseline of how to start the negotiation about the compensation for the loss of that tree.
Yeah, and cavat is used quite often with street trees to value tree populations as well. So that's the other use of it. But it's important to stress it's a notional value. It's not, you can't actually put pounds, shilling, and pence on a tree. And there are lots of other ways to value trees as well, by way of their ecosystem services or their amenity that they provide. It doesn't have to be a sort of trying to put a monetary value on a tree, but a lot of tree officers have found cavat very useful in terms of actually achieving uplifts in their budgets for tree management by demonstrating that the notional monetary value of the trees is however many £1 million. In terms of funding, I think Katrina's pretty much summed it up. Apart from central government grants, GRA grants, there is a loan as well as donations from community groups and other organisations. Other main ways, I guess, that tree planting and management is funded is through the community infrastructure levy. So some of that is available to boroughs to tap into, to make use of for tree planting and management, and also Section 106 monies. So that's a particular type of money that developers provide to local authorities in order to provide infrastructure, including trees, green infrastructure in the public realm generally. Is there anything else to add on funding?
I think those are the main things for now. Thank you, Barbara. I'm aware we've got quite a lot of other questions coming in. There's two kind of groups of questions. I think there's a big one about involving residents and businesses, and then there's also one of a slightly more thorny problem about engaging with councils where it might be tricky where some councils, partly because they don't have enough tree officers, which is a problem or an issue that both John and Barbara touched on, don't have the capacity to respond to resident queries, but also might not have had the budgets in recent years to plant replacement trees, the replacement trees that everyone would like to, but keeping people informed. So if we start on the residents' questions, Camilla had a question about kind of raised the suggestion that in Amsterdam, residents and businesses are allowed to plant in the pavement. She stressed that was climbers and shrubs rather than trees, but have the panel got some good examples of of those kind of where good examples of community involvement in street greening. And Jazzy has asked, how can we increase the input of volunteers with trees and get people more involved? So I don't know who might like to kick off from the panel on those questions.
Shall I go? I know it was. I work for the Forestry Commission, but in my past career, I was a tree officer, and in terms of it links both of them really. In my borough that I live in, Haringey, the local authority provided a sponsorship scheme. So local residents got together and paid for trees to be planted, but they were overseen by the local tree officer, so they choose the species, etc. But residents were able to fund that and look after them. And I certainly watered the 2 trees that were planted outside my house.
I think in terms of community involvement, I think it's quite difficult to allow volunteers to plant trees in streets because of the inherent health and safety issues there are. I mean, people getting run over or what have you when they're planting trees is not particularly ideal. But I think there are more opportunities in parks and in woodlands as well. And yeah, I mean, I think most local authority areas have some kind of organisation that takes donations towards tree planting as well. So in Westminster, for example, there's the Westminster Tree Trust as a charitable organisation, and they help fund some tree planting in Westminster through donations.
Thank you both. And I've noticed Russell in the chat has also given a shout out, which I should have mentioned, to the Tree Musketeers in Hackney, who do fantastic work there as well, both growing trees in their nursery and running planting events. So they're another great example to look at. And as you say, Barbara, it's not just about street trees, it's also about trees in parks. And so in terms of, both Amelia and Sarah have asked questions about, are there tips on getting councils to engage or to take trees seriously? Because obviously all of our speakers come from very enlightened organisations where trees are taken very seriously, but we do know that political priorities differ in different places and budgets differ. And in terms of ways to go about it, have you got suggestions for how to do that well?
Well, I guess I'll just give a sort of generally, I think it's sometimes people get confused in their mind, I think, between the council as some big amorphous thing that just wants to stop everyone doing everything, and then the tree officers. I've heard so much criticism over the years about tree officers almost not caring about the trees or just wanting to cut them down or whatever. I mean, I can guarantee you there's nobody out there who loves trees more than tree officers. That's why they're tree officers. It's not just that was the last job on the list of things they were thinking about doing. On the whole, if people are disappointed with what tree officers are doing, it's often because they don't have that resource, they don't have the support they need, and those local authorities that don't have any tree officers at all, they're the ones that could be perceived as maybe not taking their trees seriously enough or caring about them enough, because their budgets are also set somewhere else, and it's all about how they prioritise their resources. So communities getting together, going to local authorities, pushing for the importance of trees and the people there to manage them, I think is a helpful way to go about it. But yeah, I often hear about tree officers being accused of not caring, which is kind of laughable, really.
Yeah, I would, Jim here, I would add to that local residents forget just how influential they are. And it was John mentioned it about if you're talking to your local councillors and you let them know that you're interested in that, one of the biggest ways to influence a local authority is to change its policies and to make sure that the tree strategy or their urban forestry plan or framework is embedded in the local council's policy frameworks as either a supplementary planning document or something that's very definitely signed up by full council. A lot of the issues that arise within local authorities are due to, want of a better word, disagreements or to be more blunt, turf wars between various departments, whether it be highways department or housing departments who have lots of the tree stock on their land. So it's actually getting the council to act as a single unit. So its overarching policy or strategy is to look after that urban forest as a whole in its totality, not fragmented in the way that a lot of them do at the moment. But fairness, there are very many really good local authorities around the country who do sterling work. Unfortunately, in the papers, as John has mentioned, you generally get the sensationalist ones, things like places like Sheffield, where it's publicised, and then tree officers are put forward as spokespersons, and they get they're the ones who get the fire draw on them. So it's best, really, if as a local resident, you should go to your local councillor and seek to change policy that way.
Thanks, Jim. I'm conscious of time, and also that we've got lots of questions. Thank you, everyone, for putting those in. I'm afraid we don't have any more time to answer, but I can see that various links are being put in the chat, which might help with some of the questions. As a final wrap up from me, just on that point Jim was making, we are working with lots of organisations in the London Urban Forest Partnership on an urban forest plan for London, which will hopefully be out later in the year, which will talk about lots of these important issues and how we can work together. Because lots of points are made in the chat about how parks can have more trees, and also the importance of working with charities like Trees for Cities to organise planting events with boroughs in parks. And lots of those issues will be brought together in the forthcoming Urban Forest Plan for London. And just to wrap up, we have a final question from James, who, inspired by John, your Tree World Cup, would like each of the panellists to pick a tree for the future of the urban forest. Jim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, my favourite tree is the tree that I had in my local park. I grew up in North London, and my local park, Waterloo Park, I'll give a shout out for that, in Camden, it has a holm oak in it, and I used to queue up for the local ice cream van underneath that tree, and it's memories of not just ice cream but hot summers, long hot summers. So it's a holm oak.
Happy tree memories there from Jim. Barbara?
London Plane, it kind of has to be for me, I'm afraid. It's such a stellar tree, and it does so many things, and it's so tough, and yeah, I love them.
And are you planting more of them in Westminster?
Yeah, we plant London Planes in Westminster. Certainly wouldn't stop planting London Planes. They're iconic in London. They're a really important part of our townscape.
Excellent. John?
Yeah, well, as London Plane's been taken, I suppose I'll go with one of the trees that was most popular in the Urban Tree World Cup and drew the most excitement, which is tulip tree. Fantastic tree, maybe not used enough, and just by saying that, I know that I'm going to be rewarded with wonderful reviews later on by all sorts of people in North America saying hurrah for the tulip tree. So I'm going with tulip tree.
Thank you, John. Paul, I know this is a subject close to your heart. Do you want to chip in here?
Well, thank you, Katrina. I was racking my brains just in case you were going to ask me that question, because like I'm sure many of the other panelists, my favourite tree changes from day to day. I grew up with a beech tree behind my garden when I was a kid, and beech trees are always a great tree, but I would know that John would say that that's not a great urban tree. So I think I'm going to have to agree with Barbara. I think the London Plane is my favourite tree in London. It is the tree which I'm most fascinated about, and one which I always come back to, and it is quintessentially London.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. Neil, did you want to say anything at the end?
No, I just wanted to say thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the panelists for such a fascinating series of talks, and thanks for the audience for all your wonderful questions. We will be sharing the recording. Links will be found on the Urban Tree Festival website, and do please come along to our future daily webinars on other urban tree related topics, some of which we've touched on today: street trees, urban orchards, and planting in the greenbelt.
Thank you. And one final thing from me is just a reminder that if you've enjoyed this, and I hope you have, we'd love to take donations from you, which help the Urban Tree Festival run. We have lots of online expenses this year, So any help you can give us with that, that would be very much appreciated. And I will shut up and hand back to Katrina to finish up.
No, well, I think that's it. But just a final thanks again to our speakers for today. I think Jim pointed out the real importance of legacy planting and for us to think about what our legacy is going to be. Barbara really covered all the considerations for the future and how to really we can adapt our streets and look at altering our public realm and planting really sensibly for the future. And John talked about the importance of all the people involved and the importance of collaboration, and I think that's just outlined by the number of people who've come along today who are all really passionate about trees. So thank you all again for attending and for all your questions. Sorry we didn't get time to cover all of them, but as Neil said, do go along to other events, and there's lots of other ways to get engaged in London's and other cities, because I know lots of you are outside London as well. The joy of the Urban Tree Festival being online is that it's there's lots more people able to come, I think, than to some of the in-person events in London. But yes, it really shows how many people are interested and care. So thank you all very much again for coming.